You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for December 21st, 2018. This is the last podcast of 2018. Today I'm going to talk about the perplexing rise in unstable angina as a reason to do PCI, a good news in blood pressure, a pacing lead problem, a big discovery in peripheral artery disease, another fluoroquinolone warning, and a year-end wrap-up. Today I will start with a short but super provocative research letter from a group of Harvard researchers led by Dr. Robert Yeh. They were interested in the perplexing decrease in PCIs that are done for non-acute reasons. Now, optimists would say that this is due to doctors incorporating evidence from multiple RCTs such as COURAGE and Berry 2D. These trials found no MI or mortality reduction for PCI added to medical therapy in patients with stable coronary disease. But a more realistic explanation is that doctors have been upcoding stable patients as unstable angina. Now, the Bayesian and circumstantial evidence for this is that, number one, the presence of strong policies which are incentivizing docs to do it. For instance, in 2009, a release of the appropriate use criteria, AUC criteria. Also, national efforts to publish performance metrics, and most importantly, the possible criminal punishment for inappropriate PCI. Secondly, if a doctor codes the reason for PCI as unstable angina, there is much more leniency in the AUC or appropriate use criteria. If, on the other hand, she says the PCI is being done for stable disease, then there are many more criteria to be fulfilled for that intervention to be appropriate. So the authors wanted to get at this sudden appropriateness of PCI and decline of stable CAD PCI. The authors examined trends in PCIs coded for acute indications in the outpatient setting in 3 separate states, Florida, Michigan, and New York. They used databases which identified all inpatient and outpatient PCIs from the years 2010 to 2014, and they calculated the proportion of outpatient PCIs that were coded for acute indications relative to total PCIs performed in each state by that year. A key point to remember before I tell you the results is that unstable angina should be vanishing. As biomarkers, namely high-sensitivity troponins, get more and more sensitive, it becomes much more difficult to have true ischemic rest or prolonged pain without a rise in enzymes. By the way, Eugene Brunwald himself suggested a requiem for unstable angina 5 years ago, way back in 2013, for this very reason. And Dr. Yeh himself has published data previously suggesting temporal decreases in acute coronary syndromes. But that is not what they found in this research letter. The proportion of outpatient PCIs coded for acute indications increased over time by about 50% in Florida, by almost 300% in Michigan, and more than 13-fold in New York. Now, the increase was driven by a substantial rise in the crude number of outpatient PCIs coded for unstable angina. In New York, the number went from 242 at the beginning of the time period to over 3,100 at the end. Now, in the inpatient setting, PCIs coded for acute indications changed very little. Now, my comments here are numerous, and that includes first a great editorial and audio interview of Dr. Yeh and co-editorialist David Brown. I would recommend reading and listening to these on the JAMA Internal Medicine website. Dr. Brown notes that people have been whispering about the possibility of upcoding as the cause of the drop in PCI for stable coronary disease, but this study provides strong evidence for it, and multiple factors support the validity and importance of these findings. Okay, first, there was a massive increase observed in New York State. Now, this was likely driven by a 2011 announcement that inappropriate PCIs in New York would not be reimbursed. Another factor is that PCI for acute coronary syndrome in inpatient settings did not change. Also, as I said, unstable angina should be vanishingly small given the increasing sensitivity of high-sensitivity troponins. Plus, the increase in unstable angina-driven PCI occurred in outpatient settings. I mean, don't we treat unstable angina or acute coronary syndromes as inpatients? And finally, these observations comport well with a 2014 study that reported 40% of PCIs in the United States were coded as being performed for unstable angina. Now, I want to be fair. There are those who suggest that this spike in unstable angina could be due to more accurate coding, but I don't really believe that. But more believable, perhaps, is that there's a more uniform application of NCDR classification schemes due to cross-coding of cath reports and EHR. There might also be a change in inpatient to outpatient coding because payers don't approve inpatient stays for most PCIs anymore. In other words, there are other reasons besides upcoding to explain these findings. But I don't think so. First, consider the priors and the context. Consider basic common sense on how humans do respond to incentives. Consider also the difficulty in accepting evidence, the courage in Berry 2D evidence. Despite overwhelming evidence, we simply have trouble jettisoning the idea of the clogged pipe frame of coronary artery disease. And then there's New York. Why is New York such an outlier? How can that be just a statistical aberration? So for all these reasons, I am with Dr. Brown and Dr. McNeely in their editorial. I say, heck no, there is not a sudden rise in unstable angina, especially in outpatients. While I know and I work with many thoughtful, honest interventional cardiologists, this data is damning. Upcoding or gaming leads to people getting unnecessary procedures. It's neither honest nor noble. Noble gaming is when we have solid evidence. Noble gaming might lead to a small rise in unstable angina diagnoses. This, I believe, exposes a crisis in professionalism. And to deny it simply perpetuates the problem because learners take their cues from leaders. What's more, this sort of gaming brings more regulatory measures from payers. Overuse of PCI led to this mess, in the same way that ICD overuse led to the DOJ lawsuits. I believe this is a brave publication and that JAMA Internal Medicine remains the most important journal of our day. Next topic is blood pressure. Okay, I know that I am on record for saying that science should not have sides, meaning we should celebrate good science regardless of the experiment's results. But this week, the one-year follow-up from the Black Barbershop study returned positive results, and this is, I think, good news. Recall that the original Black Barbershop study randomized barbershops to either a pharmacist-led intervention or an active control group, and in the intervention group, barbers promoted follow-up with pharmacists who then prescribed blood pressure medications under a collaborative practice agreement. The original New England Journal of Medicine paper reported massive reductions in blood pressure at 6 months. This month, the authors published one-year follow-up in the journal Circulation, and they found that the mean reduction in blood pressure was almost 21 millimeters greater in the intervention group. The blood pressure improvement at 1 year, this is an important observation, as one of the critiques of the 6-month finding was that it could not be sustained. Now, 2 authors of the accompanying editorial lauded the results, but they worried about reproducibility of this approach due to its cost and regulatory issues limiting pharmacists' prescribing abilities. And they also correctly point out that curtailing the excess morbidity in black males takes more than just intervening with medications. They point to fixing disparities in insurance and affordable access, etc. And of course, these concerns are true, but these findings, these one-year findings, should push those interested in public health towards action. And here, I think inaction or paralysis from analysis is the far riskier strategy. Yes, of course, we need implementation research, but we also need to push to change the old models of doctor and hospital-centered health care. Third topic today is important news about a workhorse pacing lead. Patrice Wendling reports on yet another study showing problems with the workhorse St. Jude Medical, which is now Abbott Medical, pacing lead. The first study this year from Emory investigators was published in Heart Rhythm back in October. At the AHA meeting in November, a different investigator group from Minnesota reported their single-center experience, and they found inappropriate noise sensing occurred in 9% of tendral bipolar Abbott pacing leads. and that rate of inappropriate noise sensing was significantly higher than for Medtronic leads. Now, Abbott wants to say that this is due to an overly sensitive pacing system, but the authors of this study and the Emory study found that oversensing due to noise occurred in only 1% of cases when Abbott generators were connected with Medtronic leads. Now, Patrice Wendling has a nice recap of both these studies, and she points to an editorial from Dr. Lawrence Stearns from Canada, who, with his opening quote, many paragraphs on speculation of confounders, and final paragraph where he calls for more data, effectively diffuses any alarm here. But don't be confused. I am alarmed by this problem. We have seen this problem in our clinic. And whenever you tweet something about a tendril lead, other EPs chime in saying that they have seen it. And crucially, these leads are the workhorse leads for a leading pacing company. I've had a patient almost die from a 2-year-old 2088 tendril lead failure. It was due to pacing inhibition. And I sent the lead back, and it came back with a diagnosis of insulation breach from a abrasion from the can. Now, earlier in the year, I wrote a feature column on this problem, and in that column, I cite some biophysical studies that suggest plausible reasons to think that the Optum, OPTIM, Optum insulation may not be durable. So mark my words on this. You're going to see more studies coming on this, and I would not be surprised if these two studies are the tip of an iceberg. I no longer use this lead, especially in pacemaker-dependent patients. Next topic is also a surprising and important finding in peripheral artery disease. Paclitaxel-coated stents in the coronary arteries are a first-generation device, and they've been replaced by second-generation drug-eluting stents. But in peripheral artery disease and infrainguinal stenoses, recent studies have shown paclitaxel drug-eluting stents and drug-coated balloons have efficacy for significantly reducing restenosis and thereby reducing the risk of recurrent limb ischemia. Indeed, several of these devices have received CE mark and FDA approval. However, one recent study suggested higher rates of major amputations in the active paclitaxel stent arm, and a couple of RCTs that had longer follow-up hinted at late mortality in the paclitaxel arm. These signals, however, have largely been ignored by experts as statistical artifact. Not anymore. Authors from Greece and the UK have published a new meta-analysis of RCTs that investigated paclitaxel-coated devices in the femoropopliteal arteries, and they found stunning results. This meta-analysis included 28 RCTs with over 4,600 patients. At 1 year, it didn't look too bad. All-cause death at 1 year, there were no differences. However, all-cause death at 2 years, which included 12 RCTs, showed significantly increased death with paclitaxel devices. It was 7.2% versus 3.8%. The relative risk ratio 1.68, which was statistically significant, and the number needed to harm was 29. But it gets worse. At 5 years, the relative risk for higher death rate increased to almost double at 1.93, and the number needed to harm with the paclitaxel stent was 14. 3 factors increase our confidence in this signal. First, there was low heterogeneity of the signals from the included trials. That's important in meta-analysis. Meta-regression showed that studies with higher doses of the paclitaxel, in other words, longer, bigger stents, associated with a higher death rate. And trial sequential analyses excluded false positive findings with 99% certainty. Now, the mechanism of higher death is not known. The authors have a beautiful discussion of this in their paper that's published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. But remember, paclitaxel is Taxol, which is a commonly used chemotherapeutic agent, and obviously it has potential toxicity. The authors discuss Bradford Hill's criteria for establishing a causal relationship between a presumed cause and an observed health effect, and paclitaxel meets the evidence of strength, consistency, temporality, and biological gradient criterion. Now, within days of publication of this meta-analysis, organizers of 3 PAD trials announced they were suspending enrollment. This is big. First, we see a lot of meta-analyses these days, and here is one that has contributed really important work. Second, this story shows the importance of longer-term follow-up in clinical trials. Now, for many reasons, due to financial constraints or other biases, many cardiovascular trials are truncated and have short-term follow-up. Third comment, now whether in stents or given systemically, drugs can affect many different organ systems and they can have late effects. Ex ante, or before this publication, we would have all considered any long-term harm from paclitaxel as an unknown event. Finally, and this is the key, I think that this is yet more evidence for being a medical conservative, i.e. a slow adopting physician. And speaking of being a slow adopting and careful conservative physician, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a warning this week that fluoroquinolones use can increase the risk of aortic aneurysm. FDA says to avoid prescribing this antibiotic to patients with or at risk for an aortic aneurysm, such as those with peripheral artery disease, hypertension, Marfan syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos syndromes, and the elderly. Listen to this, quote, for patients who have an aortic aneurysm or are known to be at risk for an aortic aneurysm, we do not believe the benefits outweigh the risk and alternative treatment should be considered. The data from this warning comes from the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System database and 4 observational studies that all show in various ways an association of fluoroquinolone exposure and aortic aneurysm or dissection. Now, I looked at these observational studies and they are all typically confounded and none can be taken as causal. Still, though, taken together, I can see why FDA made this announcement. And this is not the first warning on these drugs. Other FDA warnings with fluoroquinolones include hypoglycemia, mentation effects, tendon rupture, peripheral neuropathy, and of course, we should all never forget that fluoroquinolones have significant QT prolonging effects. Here again, the benefits of being a medical conservative. If there are alternative, less risky, or less expensive antibiotics, obviously use them. Before I close, I want to make 2 announcements. One is that there are 2 year-end recap pieces. I wrote a top 10 cardiology stories of 2018, and Dr. Robert Harrington and Michael Gibson give their top trials of 2018, and these are available on the website. The second announcement is that I'll take a week off next week for Christmas and then return the first week of January. Finally, I want to say thank you. Thank you a lot. I've had fun with this year, and I've been struck by how many of you come up to me, say at meetings, to say you've listened to This Week in Cardiology. Thanks for that. I hope you all have a peaceful holiday week, and I will see you again in 2019.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.